Good day and welcome to Fawcett v. Fildebrandt. I'm Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard, and this is the very first episode, our first, well, I guess to borrow a term from our first guest, Jen Gerson, experimental episode to see how well it goes. I'm going to be joined by my regular co-host, Max Fawcett, who is the lead columnist for Canada's National Observer. This began when first Max invited me on his show, Maxed Out, and we were expected to disagree and be assholes to one another, and it had a surprisingly civil and fruitful conversation. And I reciprocated, hoping that maybe I'd get a rise out of him, and I failed as well. Coming at things from different angles, but unfortunately managing to find more common ground than we had hoped. But we put our heads together and thought, kind of reminisced about the old firing line show that, not firing line, Crossfire, that CNN had on. And we thought that, well, Canada and the West could use something like that. So that's what we're doing here today with our first episode of Fawcett versus Fildebrandt. Our first show is we're going to deal with one big question, which will obviously have a lot of smaller questions as a part of it. Our first question on our first episode is, can and should Canada's legacy media be saved? Before we get into that, though, I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Max Fawcett of Canada's National Observer.
Thank you, Derek. Pleasure to be here. This is going to be interesting. See if we can find a way to disagree a little more loudly than perhaps we have in the past. But we have someone here, I think, that both of us have probably disagreed with on more than one occasion. Jen Gerson needs no introduction, but I will give her one anyways. Don't worry, don't look scared. She is I would say, kind of perfect blend of new media and old media. So Jen got her start in the mainstream media, working for the Calgary Herald, working for Post Media, and still keeps a toe in those waters to this day as what's the official? You're a part-time columnist with the Globe and Mail?
Contributing columnist with the Globe and Mail.
Contributing columnist with the Globe and Mail.
On occasion when they forget that they don't like me anymore.
There we go. Yeah. But she is the co-founder of The Line, which is, I think, one of the most successful and encouraging startups in the new media space in our country. Sort of a centrist, center-right perspective, but brings on a lot of really smart, interesting voices and is making a go of things financially, is doing well. And I think for anyone who says, if we just let the old ones go away, the new ones will flourish, they are thinking of The Line in a lot of respects there. So it is a pleasure to have Jen on.
Well, they can't get rid of me. I mean, you're stuck with me in some form or another. I'm like a barnacle in the entire industry.
You're the cockroach of the media.
Exactly. I'll die here. It's my destiny.
Well, it's good to have you on.
Thank you. I'm instantly regretting my life decisions and wondering what I got myself into, but let's give it a shot.
All right. Well, I guess we'll just start with the big question, and I'm sure you're going to have a quippy, lippy answer for it, but can and should Canada's legacy media be saved?
Nope.
Next.
Podcast over.
I expected a hard no, but maybe elaborate a bit.
Well, what do you mean by saved? Saved by whom and under what terms?
I think it's very clear they're not capable of saving themselves. They've had a lot of time to do it. They can't. I suppose the answer would then be, can the state? Should the state?
No. I don't know what to say. If we're dealing with private for-profit corporations that have had every opportunity to make the transition to a digital first space and have demonstrated over the course of 30 years that they are incapable of doing it in a financially sustainable manner, why should the state save them? I mean, make the argument for me. Make the argument for why the state ought to save them. Just devil's argument. Let's play with that idea.
Making Derek make this argument, by the way, is hilarious.
Oh,
so
yeah. I'm here to just push everyone's buttons. Throw it out there.
This was an interesting bit of jujitsu the two of you have done.
Yeah.
Making me make the argument. This was from Sunday's Toronto Star, where I'll paraphrase. They have a picture of Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez up there. And they more or less frame it as, this is the front page above the masthead. And they said, along the lines of, will Pablo Rodriguez defeat Meta and Google and save the news industry in Canada?
So right off the bat, just great independent, fair, detached journalism. I mean, while they're at it, why didn't they just put him on a pedestal, put a little frame around his face, do a little smiley face and some heart emojis around too? That's exactly the sort of mentality you want to have as a national newspaper.
And I'm sure they put a financial. I can't confirm. I haven't looked into it. I don't have the print version, but $20 says they probably didn't put a disclosure on there, but their wild conflict of interest of hundreds of millions of dollars. In covering that story.
Can this really nice, awesome minister save us? Don't you love this
Will he
guy?
save democracy?
Will he save democracy?
So I'll try to frame it the way these guys do. It's that they're not saying we need to go away, the independents need to go away, but they're saying that we're not really adding to the conversation, that legacy media is the guardian of reliable and factual journalism, and without these institutions in particular,
reliable, factual journalism goes away.
Yeah,
because legacy
and then therefore democracy itself.
Because legacy media in the last 10 years and 5 years in particular has just covered itself with glory in terms of being the bastions of reliable, public service journalism, with exceptions that I can certainly happily name if you like. What you have is a legacy media that has done nothing but essentially cut itself down to nothing, and prove itself less and less competent and capable of just marshaling the resources required to cover the basic news in a daily way. We've seen the legacy media pull out of beats, fire people en masse. We've seen them pull out of jurisdictions. So how much when we talk about saving sort of things like Post Media or Torstar or CTV or things like that, what do we mean here? Are we talking about keeping them technically in their current state, where in Post Media's case, what you have is government money going to overwhelmingly service American badged hedgies debt plays? Or are you talking about saving them in a way that you're restoring them to what they looked like 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Why stop there? Why not try and fund them to the extent that they look like the newsrooms look like they did in the 80s or the 70s? Like what does saving mean in this context?
Well, I think it's a fair question because, as you point out, sort of keeping them in their current Weekend at Bernie's state is not really saving them. It is keeping them from not dying, because I think no government, or certainly this government, does not want that on their watch, and they especially don't want the Toronto Star dying on their watch. That has always, I think, been the understood quid pro quo, is that they're going to bail out Post Media because they want to bail out the Toronto Star, and they can't do one without the other.
And they live in a mindset from 1999, where this is actually some kind of fair exchange for the purposes of the Canadian public. Because if we bail out your left-wing media organization, we'll bail out your right-wing media organization, and what other organization counts, and what other factors matter in this conversation.
Totally,
because they don't.
But I think there's a legitimate concern around news gathering, news dissemination, reporting, funding the things that are not easy. So I talked about the line. The line is a success. The line does opinion, and opinion is, as you know, it's lower cost, lower barrier to entry, and people want it. People want opinions. People don't necessarily want a 10-part series on corruption within the schools or some sort of corporate malfeasance. That takes work. It's not sexy. And my concern, and I think a lot of people's concern, maybe even the government, is that if we don't find a way to fund journalism, that will go away completely.
So my response to this is that, to some extent, what we're talking about are the aesthetic and class concerns of a overthrown priestly class. I mean, when you say stuff like, well, the people don't actually want the 10-part series of corruption on their local school council or whatever, aren't you hearing a little bit of, but the plebes won't listen to the opera there?
No, it's not the opera.
Well, but it is, because if you can't present or package your journalism in a way that an audience will find value in it, that's the issue, right? The issue isn't with saving the media. The issue isn't with government funding. The issue is with what you fear your audience will accept or what they're willing to fund.
It's the economics of it.
Yeah.
That,
sure.
Think of it through basic inputs and outputs. Inputs of time, especially investigative work. So, you'll get, we've all been pitched, hey, I've got the big story, and 9 times out of 10, probably more, it's a quack, and he's got a conspiracy theory. But every once in a while, okay, maybe this one's got some merit, and so you give it to an editor who gives it to a reporter, and that reporter might follow this thing. And it could, if it's a big story, it could take weeks, maybe more. And there's a really good chance at the end of the day, there's a dead end. There's nothing you can publish. And so you've invested, your inputs are a lot of time and a lot of, therefore, money, and you got nothing out of it, which is why it's easier and more economical to do opinion or short news of the day, latest crap going on. So that's
basically,
why
the thing is, you actually need to have a media organization that's not just surviving paycheck to paycheck. You need a media organization that's thriving and bringing in enough money to be able to divert resources to potentially low cost outcomes, high reward, low cost outcomes. But I would say, like, to say there's no market value in that is wrong, because as we've seen, when there's certain investigative pieces or there's certain types of reported pieces, and when they hit, they're hugely profitable. They can be hugely lucrative.
well, like Global Mail covering China, like that was the Global
China,
Mail,
exactly.
Global Mail / CTV's baby. They did that.
Sure,
and
but then the other thing I would say is, when Matt and I do spend money to send one of us to a thing to do on the ground reporting, that is some of those lucrative stuff that we do, because it brings in and generates subscriptions, like paid subscriptions from an audience that suddenly is like, oh, you guys are more than an opinion outlet. You're doing stuff of value, and I'm willing to support that. So there's a market argument for doing all that kind of stuff. But and I wouldn't underestimate the market value for that. But getting away from the market, I do think that it's very possible that there are going to be types of high risk, high reward journalism that costs a lot of money to produce and may or may not produce a return. And in a market that is where newsrooms are much more pared down, they're newsrooms of 5, 10, 15 people, and where you have newsrooms and news organizations that just don't have the megatons of money that they did 20, 30 years ago, that becomes a harder thing to picture working, right? I do think there are private models that will make it work, but we don't know what those models are right now, and that's going to emerge over time. So I would say, yeah, there is a place for the state to step in and address the potential market failure here. I do think that's right.
what do you think that could look like?
The CBC, that's what it looks like. The federal government is already hugely invested in Canadian journalism to the tune of the CBC, which gets $1 billion a year in public funding. Like, if the CBC isn't well equipped to address the market failures that are going to emerge as a result of this terrible apocalypse that we're all about to go through, then what the hell is it good for?
Okay, but if let's say there's a redefinition of the CBC's mandate,
Sure,
and they take all the programmatic television, scripted television, they take all the opinion out of it, and they just put all the money into reporting in communities that aren't well served, in local communities, doing the things that maybe other people don't want to do. Is there going to be a consensus around that reporting and that it's acceptable, that it's of public interest, or is it just going to become yet another front in the culture war of like, well, we can't trust the reporting on XYZ because it comes from the dreaded CBC?
everything is going to become a front in the culture war, but the way that you best prevent becoming a front in the culture war is by preempting it and understanding that that's a risk, and the CBC has to be able to address it. And this is why I've made the argument that a mandate review for the CBC is so crucial, because a significant portion of the population has so fundamentally lost trust in the CBC that it's not going to be able to serve its basic function under the status quo.
Yeah,
I just don't think it's there.
I've made the same argument.
And I think that the mandate that you've described is pretty close to what I would also agree with. But I would go a little bit further, and I would say I would like a CBC that does not see itself in competition with private media, because otherwise what you have is you've got a new imperial oil. You have a new, essentially monopolistic journalistic exercise. But what I would like to see is a CBC that sees itself in service to its local journalism organizations and startups. So I would like to see, for example, all of the written content is maybe open license. So every media organization can use it. All of its photos, open license. All of its videos, open license. I would like to see massive money put into the CBC archives. I'd like to see, for example, I would just like to see a shift in mindset, because right now I think the CBC sees its role as dictating to Canadians what Canadian values are. And I would like to see them shift that way of thinking into saying, no, our role is to serve Canadians.
Well, and because there's this confusion over, I think, what they are, and they feel this sort of survival instinct fear of like, well, we gotta get bigger or we're gonna get smaller.
Yeah.
They go to the places where they should actively be backing away from. They go to the advertising, they go to the things that sell, so opinion, what have you, whereas they should be going, oh no, the private market is doing a very good job there. Yeah. We'll go over here. We'll go over to the thing that is not sexy, is not attractive, but it serves a public interest.
And what if you were to have like a CBC instead of in only major urban centers, more and more doing what CBC Calgary did, which is branching out to places like Lethbridge,
Totally.
Medicine Hat, these sorts of low, and saying, hey, our job is to serve this particular center. And maybe part of our job is going to be providing journalism training.
Mhm.
Maybe part of our job is going to be sharing what journalism values looks like. Maybe part of our job is going to be helping people to do media editing. We're going to teach people how to use editing software. We're going to open up our facilities so that local media organizations can come in and use broadcast facilities. They can use our podcast studios. We're going to see ourselves less as a competitor in this space and more like a public library.
Like infrastructure,
We're
we're going to provide access to the tools of journalism for community members so they can make their own contributions.
I would like to see the CBC understand that we're about to go through a media apocalypse. It's going to last 5 to 20 years, and their role is to be the seed bank in the apocalypse.
The ark.
The preservation of certain values and virtues that they can then help, that can be then used to help other private media organizations flourish and create their own for-profit and financially successful organizations.
But is there any, okay, one of the basic principles of capitalism is creative destruction, that the existing firms and industries will often need to be destroyed for capital to be reallocated to the new. And that's, the federal government is very clearly doing everything in its power humanly possible to stop that from happening. I guess there's a couple scenarios we can look at, but based on the current scenario, we have media bailouts, we've got C-18, all of this in place. What do you think the emerging new media is going to look like if that status quo remains? Let's say, there's no alternative scenario where Poilievre comes to power and blows all that up. Just Trudeau and his successors continue on there, and this is the regime, and they continue to pile one thing on top of another. What's your prognostication of what it's going to look like?
Sickly, incredibly, and intensely dull. Absolutely unwilling to innovate and take risks. Just a really awful place for ambitious young journalists to work. You're going to see a huge brain drain, because who wants to work in that kind of media environment? Like, nobody. And I just sort of think it's going to be a slow chipping away of independence over time, right? You're just going to see a lot of these private media organizations fall further and further into whatever government it is. So I'm not even talking about an ideological government, but it's going to be just more inclined not to make waves with the existing government. Because why pick a fight if we don't have to? And we don't really want to piss the wrong people off. And it's not gonna be an obvious, like, oh, hey, we're going to become propagandists for the Liberals overnight. It's just going to be a slow dulling of the entire media market. It's going to get a little more boring, a little less controversial, a little less willing to push, a little less, and it's just going to chip away over time. It's going to get worse and worse.
I think one of the things that is not commonly understood among the non-journalist class is how bad things already are. I think people look at papers like the Herald or the Journal, or they look at the Toronto Star and they think, well, there must be like hundreds of journalists still working in there, pursuing their craft. And I heard from someone who is, close to the Journal, they're like, I think it was like fewer than 5 people are reporters there now. Like it is already dead.
There's no there anymore.
It is just
We've got more in like the newsroom on the other side of this wall than the Journal probably has.
A lot of it is management and then life support is sort of what is sustaining things. So, I think I'm supportive of the idea of taking it off the ventilator. My concern is just always, what do we lose when we do that? Because there was a really interesting podcast with Paul Wells, Andrew Coyne, David Hurley, and oh God, her name escapes me. She worked at Le Journal, CBC, in
Chantal?
Not Chantal. No. Oh God, this is going to go badly for me. But anyways, and they were talking about the future of the media. What do we do? And they all sort of seem to say, like, oh, look at the New York Times. There's Figaro in France. Like, just let the market figure it out. Canada's in English Canada. Quebec is a whole different story. But in Canada, English Canada, our media market is the hardest, I think, in the world in terms of what you have to do to build a new media company, because we're competing with the Americans. we don't have population scale. We don't have a geographic or cultural barrier that makes people, I need to get the news from somewhere because the people on the other side speak Welsh or they speak French. And I just think that if we put our faith in the market, I think we are ignoring the fact that the market in Canada is unusually challenging.
I'm not ignoring the market. I'm saying that's the argument for having the CBC.
Yeah.
Right. Like if you have a non-challenging environment, the logic for the CBC disappears.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, I mean, I think that when you say creative destruction, that's a really pretty term. It maybe underplays what destruction looks like and how ugly that can.
I've never had anyone describe it as a pretty term.
No,
I think it's beautiful.
I mean, it's yeah, we're going to have a couple of really, really weird years, and we're going to see what the impacts in a country that is sparsely populated, very diverse in many different ways, including geographically and culturally. What happens when you lose a unified narrative that follows through a mainstream media conversation? When we lose that, and we're losing it, that's going to get weird. And I think especially in some small towns, underserviced or unserviced markets, things are going to get really weird. I've heard stories of people going in through small towns in British Columbia, and like the whole QAnon craze is the predominant craze now. Like that is just overwhelmingly accepted in those small communities and cultures because they don't have access to great information, or their cultural milieu is such that they're getting their news on particular Facebook groups, right?
Just yesterday, actually, I had, without naming them, I had a small local community paper approach us about buying them out or doing essentially share swap where they would come in as a little part of us. But I mean, there was just an absolute no way to make that work. First of all, I could barely locate where they were on a map, but it's local paper community. No one's paying for a paper subscription anymore, so you don't have that. And they're no longer have a monopoly on advertising. That ended not with Facebook and Google, but with Kijiji. That was dead a long time ago.
Craigslist, Kijiji.
Yeah, there's no way. And I do think these small ones, they're all gonna die. I don't see a way out of it.
But what potentially replaces them? What potentially replaces them are people from within these communities who decide to take up the role of serving their communities with information that's useful to their neighbors and their friends, probably through platforms like Substack, platforms like Facebook. And can these people make a living on a subscription-based model?
Well, that's
yes.
the question. Of
course they can, because you don't need a lot of money to make you don't need a lot of subscribers to make money on a subscription model. Even if you're in a town of 10,000 people, and you have 100, maybe if you're lucky, up to 200 or 1,000 of those people paying you a small amount of money, and that's before you're looking at any local advertising revenue, you can potentially have a living in that. If you're in a town where your cost of living is reasonable, right? So, is it going to be a newsroom of 5 people with a monopoly of advertising? No, but is it going to be maybe mom and pop kind of operations that are providing a service to their community because they saw a vacuum and maybe were able to monetize that to a reasonable degree? I think that's a potential.
Maybe let's talk about the transition, though. You're talking about there's little communities in BC where everyone's kind of getting their news on QAnon. I think inevitably in the transition there's going to be some weird shit. There's going to be stuff like that.
100%.
I think we'd probably come through all right on the other side. I mean, people believed all sorts of weird stuff in the 60s, and they came out through, and they're like, "Oh, that was weird. Let's get back to work."
As long as there's a penalty for the weirdness, I think that's.
What do you mean a penalty for the weirdness?
There used to be a social penalty if you were a person who was putting newsletters on cars' windshields, and they said you had your worldview and you put it there.
How familiar were you with the 60s?
Pretty familiar. Pretty familiar.
There wasn't a lot of social penalty for weirdness.
Eventually there was. Absolutely there was.
Well, eventually,
it was called the 80s.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's what we're talking about. That's the process, right? We're going to go through this experimental phase where people are going to, the Satanic Panic, which is the subject of my book, happened in the 80s. People believe in all kinds of crazy shit. But yes, there is going to be this weird intermediation period. People are going to start to believe all kinds of alternative narrative theories. And they will, in time, live or die on the value that they have to their community. And yes, you can't, I don't see how you practically punish people for buying into QAnon.
You don't practically do it because that would be, you can't tax them.
No,
but
you can't tax them. You can,
but the challenge is that right now
This is Canada. They will try.
Well, okay, fair enough. But we have technologies now that allow people to actively seek out other people with the same views as them and then build foundations around those communities that doesn't let anything into them, right? That did not exist in the 80s. That did not exist in the 60s.
Well, actually, it did at a smaller scale.
At a much smaller scale.
Like part of the reason, this is where we get into my book, part of the reason why the Satanic Panic took off the way it did was because you had small communities of professionals who would meet regularly for conferences where ideas around satanic ritual abuse and all of these kinds of theories would spread within these relatively closed professional groups. And the professionals would leave their conferences, go back to their home communities and spread them within there. That was one of the chief agents of travel for this conspiracy. You're seeing that on social media happen at scale, right? That's the difference. And that's what's extremely disruptive about that. But the other thing I would say is that in the past, when you had moral panics like the Satanic Panic, it's my model for a lot of this stuff for obvious reasons. Those moral panics would last years and years and years and then burn themselves out. What you're seeing now is a lot of moral panics and conspiracies lasting a couple of months and now burning themselves out, and then with a higher degree of frequency, right? So we're in a place of just radical experimentation where people are trying on alternative narrative theories. It's kind of what I call a lot of this stuff. And it doesn't hold. It doesn't manage to capture the mainstream in the way that it did previously, and it burns itself out at a much higher rate.
So, are you saying?
I don't know if it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's not. I don't expect within 10 years that because of the collapse of mainstream media that we're all going to be like hailing Q. I don't think that's going to be where this goes.
But okay, surely the Satanic, and I confess that I'm not deeply knowledgeable about the Satanic Panic. But
let me tell you all about it.
But that was confined to a very small slice of the population.
No, it wasn't.
No.
This is actually something that is really interesting. This was mainstream. This was radically mainstream. This was mainstream in modern therapy. This was mainstream in media. This was absolutely mainstream in police departments all across North America and eventually
I remember
the world.
In churches in the 90s. It was petering out, but it was still there.
This was mainstream in a religious space at the time, and it was also concurrent with the rise of evangelical Christianity as well. This was not some like the Satanic Panic of the 80s and 90s was way more mainstream than QAnon is today.
Interesting.
Way more mainstream, and there's some interesting reasons why that happened. Even there are even people today who are ostensibly mainstream people who are very, very convinced. In fact, you can make the argument that the Satanic Panic became QAnon. Right. So this was not a small thing. Oprah, Geraldo, they were all.
It's true.
This was on the front page of the Globe and Mail. This was.
There's the whole thing about heavy metal and playing the records backwards.
At the upper echelons of things like psychological sciences here in Canada were firm proponents.
When I was a kid, I had to keep my Marilyn Manson CDs pretty hidden. Like that's the way it was. Maybe we could switch it back a little bit to where we were. To beat journalism. The regular grind of the news, watching City Hall, watching the legislature. One reason I think you were both talking about this, that most of the new media tends to focus on analysis and opinion on the news that's already out there, is because beat journalism is so expensive.
Also, there's a limited market for it.
There's a limited market, but another is the cost as well. There's a few things like our news department is almost all full-time salaried reporters. Our opinion side is one editor and then a bunch of contracted freelance writers. News generally, for the most part, requires salaried full-time people, and so it's a totally different economic model. What do you think beat journalism is going to look like 10 years from now? If let's just say Rodriguez gets hit by a bus. Not that I would say that, but let's just say he gets hit by a bus. Let's say his bill gets hit by a bus, and the bailouts get hit by a bus. Just it all dies, and they have an epiphany, and they say no more bailouts, no more C-18. We're just going to let the market go. What does beat journalism look like in a decade?
Regardless of the bailouts, the bailouts aren't actually going to dramatically shift the course of anyone's destiny here. We're talking about the bailouts.
No, but they slow down the change.
They slow down the change. They don't stop it.
But let's just say that stuff ended.
But
we
in
had
10
10
to
years
15
of
years,
growth.
a lot of beat journalism is going to be replaced by AI. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So, local City Hall puts up a transcript of all of its meetings and subcommittee meetings, and AI goes through it, creates a story. This goes back to a human editor. The human editor double checks for facts, tries to put anything in context. It pops up on the website. Now, all of a sudden, a News Star article that used to take hours and hours and hours to produce can be produced in 10 minutes. So, weather stories. Humans are not going to be producing weather stories in 10 years. Sports. Humans are not going to be producing sports in 10 years. Is it going to replace all of journalism and all reporting? Absolutely not. AI can't do that. But AI can not. But AI can will certainly replace day-to-day coverage of what's happening in Parliament. AI can replace day-to-day coverage of what's happening. Just anything that's automated where the text can be put online. AI can do an adequate job of covering and filling in those gaps.
It's already pretty much there, where you can also have a fake AI person who looks like a reporter, and you can have them in a fake AI studio and reading the news looking like it was on CNN. It's not just the text now.
Their hair will never go gray, so great. But no, it's not going to replace all journalism, and I don't see AI as being a threat to journalism, because let's be honest here, AI is not going to replace journalism jobs. The journalism jobs are already gone. AI is going to serve as a tool for human journalists, human editors to massively increase their output
and to build on.
I
think one of the problems right now is we're still stuck in a mode where we're trying to protect things that were done simply because they exist, right? Well, that job was there, we got to protect it. And to make journalism successful and thrive, it has to be not what have we done, but what should we do, right? What need is not being currently met by technology, by the market? And we don't need people to cover box scores in baseball. We have that already. We don't need people to, like Jen said, do the sort of TikTok of what happened in the legislature, because AI can do that. But there are some things that technology definitely cannot or will not do. And those are the places that journalism should be going into.
Yeah, exactly.
And until we get that mindset shift away from how do we protect to how do we build, I think we're going to be in this sort of purgatory.
Yeah. Maybe small little sidetrack, but I think it's relevant to this. A question that we've been tackling here at the Western Standard is, we are looking at how we integrate AI. What do you think are some of the guidelines a publication or newsroom should have around legitimate and illegitimate use of AI in the newsroom?
That's going to be such an interesting conversation in the next years. I don't think AI is like exactly where it needs to be for us to do this, but it's so close that we need to start having that conversation. I think disclosure is the first one. If this is not written by a human, I do think that until AI becomes so normalized that everyone just sort of assumes that a lot of this stuff isn't being written by human, I do think that you need very proactive disclosure with people about it. Also, I do think that I wouldn't let the machines run wild without a human supervision or human editor like that. I think you still need to have somebody.
I just rewatched The Terminator this weekend.
So there you go. But I do think that you need, if you're going to have an AI sort of recap the latest happenings at a city council meeting, you still need a human on the other side of that, double checking the quotes, making sure everything is correct. There's still going to be a fact checking process this stuff's going to need to go through. And I think that you always need to ask yourself, is this AI replacing humans, or is this tool making us more helping humans? That the tool shouldn't be an end in and of itself. I would say the tool should be an aid to human productivity, not a replacement for human creativity.
That's if we're kind of assuming in this that AI is going to be used within publications, current and future publications. But this could very easily take the form of, well, let's say Google. Google's not allowed to do news in Canada anymore. Well, they might just say, we'll create our own news.
Well, they're already there.
I hope so.
So their big thing is they're tired of their search sending people off of their servers.
Yeah.
And so what they're going to do is when next time you Google, I need a recipe for such and such, rather than it sending you to allrecipes.com, they'll just have their AI serve up the recipe for you.
Yeah.
And you stay on their turf and you pay them your money. that they are going to try to eat more of the pie.
So, and I'm just picturing like, okay, so what
So
if
it might not even be us using the AI.
No.
We might just get completely cut out and AI
Yeah, potentially.
without any human supervision,
Well,
because it'll be easier.
I don't think the AI is there to be used without human supervision. I really don't.
Not yet, but I mean, it could be there really soon.
Could be, but I still think that you're going to have use for our skill sets. Let's just say, even in an AI dominated.
We all hope so.
Space.
But...
Well, and I think it will send us ideally up the value chain. There's a lot of things that journalists do right now, and certainly used to do. You know, the glory days. There's a lot of pointless tasks that were being done inefficiently.
Absolute grunt work.
And now the machine will do it for us, and we get to focus our mental energies on analysis, on higher thinking, on delivering value for the customer in a way that there's more than just the AI can do. I think it will push good journalists to a better place.
Well, except the problem is that good journalists get their start on the grunt work.
Yes.
So if you get rid of all of that need to do some of that grunt work stuff, I mean, my first job at the Toronto Star was listening to the radio room, right? It was listening to police and radio scanners, waiting for someone to die or waiting for a terrible thing to happen, and then gathering information about it. You couldn't replicate that training now. And if we have a situation where AI is able to do what radio roomers used to do, firstly, you're just losing opportunities for young journalists to get the training and the mentorship that we used to get. Now, that being said, we've already lost it. It's already gone. So where do you balance this? I don't know. But my suspicion is that the real crisis, or the next crisis after this crisis, is going to be, how do you train up a whole generation of journalists in an AI space where all of those mentorship and training opportunities are now gone, and you're asking them to go from university to essentially straight into analysis or high level thinking journalism before they've had the 10-year apprenticeship that they actually need to do that.
I get that and I understand it, but I keep on having this meme in my head that keeps recurring when you're talking about this. And it's, we all remember our, grade 4 math teacher when we complain about learning our multiplication table saying, well, you're not always going to have a calculator in your pocket. And God damn, they were wrong. Yeah, it's nice if you know your times tables, but it's kind of useless now because we all have a super calculator in our pocket that could put a man on Mars. So maybe it'll be the equivalent of that. Maybe it's just this is just something we don't even really need to worry about anymore, and they're just going to go straight to calculus with their weird graphing calculator.
Or maybe Western civilization collapses and we all have to go back to some kind of repeat of the local grain news. I mean, like I said, I'm not really worried about my ability to function in the future world. I just sort of think that it's not going to look like it was in the past.
And being wedded to the way it was is a pretty good way to sort of tip the scales in the wrong direction. I mean, I'm an optimist, so I'm a technological optimist. But to me, the interesting premise with AI, the thing that AI forces us to confront as journalists is, how do we be trusted? How can we demonstrate and earn trust from the people who use our services? And I think the problem with journalism is, for a long time, we've taken that for granted. We show up assuming we're trusted, right? You walk into the building, it has the letter, it has the masthead, and you're like, I'm trusted. And you haven't had to work for it. And I think the new environment that we're in, you have to prove that you're trustable. You can't make mistakes. You have to be accountable when you are or when you do. And I think that has to be sort of a defining question when media companies roll out AI is, how does this impact our trust? Does it increase or decrease the amount that our users, our supporters, our customers trust us? And I'm still not sure that thought is as prominent as it should be.
I think that's true if we're talking about kind of, catch-all publications that people on both sides of the divide used to be able to read at the same time and more or less have an agreement on facts on. This is probably the wrong term for it, but perhaps we're heading towards kind of a return of the yellow press. Maybe not as extreme, not as explicitly partisan, but
sure, maybe,
if nothing else, a more tribal press where, Western Standard readers trust the Western Standard, but they don't trust the National Observer. National Observer readers trust you guys, but won't trust anything from us.
The yellow press was the norm for most of the history of the press. The whole period where we all have shared narratives and a shared media conversation is actually relatively recent. Prior to this, the more norm thing was like you had your press, you had your ideological newspaper that you went to and you relied on, and your writers and your readers to tell you about the day. You had pamphlets and all that kind of thing. So like the tribal and highly siloed media environment, it is actually the norm for society. It just hasn't been the norm in our lifetimes. And that's what the shift that we're getting used to. But I'm also wondering if the future, going back to Google, if the future is Google creating its own news hub in every community, right? Mm-hmm. Using AI, and maybe they have a handful of journalist editors in every region helping to direct generation of news stories, doing the weather, doing the sports, doing the local town meetings, doing the local blah, 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 blah. Then that becomes the shared thing. Everybody has essentially the same news hub. Mm-hmm. And then you have your Western standards, your nationals, or more interesting, in-depth stuff, or the good writing, right? I mean, an AI can do good writing, which is not as fun now, is it? So what if that's how we reestablish a kind of shared narrative, is through AI generated news hubs? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying that's the way it's going to be. I'm just saying that could be one way this picture rolls out.
I think the danger there is always in, if there's a central sort of one publication or one company that's running things, what happens? The control of that becomes very, very valuable and very, very contestable.
Well, we already saw that with social media trying to grapple with regulating what could be posted on it during COVID, because there was some disinformation, but a lot of times, as it would turn out, things weren't disinformation. If we're talking like leaks from the Wuhan lab, that stuff was flagged as fake news, turned out not to be. And so social media especially Google, YouTube, Facebook and YouTube would highly regulate what was allowed and ban you if not. But that was regulating who could post onto it. Now it just might be, it could get more extreme to that if the common narrative is just kind of a Google News.
This is exactly the same conversation we've been having for the last however many decades with the consolidation of news under Postmedia.
Yep.
Right? I mean, yes, when you have one entity controlling the majority of the content, you run into these problems. And this is why you need to have strong antitrust conversations. Maybe the Google News Hub is going to be different from I don't know how that's going to work out. I'm sure that eventually someone's going to go after Google for antitrust stuff in Canada. This will not prevent that. Or potentially it's another company. It's another company doing the equivalent of this, right? So
actually, part of the problem, I think, is C18 is going after Google and Facebook all the wrong way. I think there is probably a strong case for antitrust against both of these companies. Absolutely. But I'm not sure that can happen in Canada. I think that is got to come from the United States.
There's no track record of being able to consolidation.
Well, we love monopolies as long as they're Canadian monopolies.
Exactly. I mean, like that's how the media got into this situation in the first place, right?
I heard someone describe us as the test case on C18 for the Americans, and I thought, that seems backwards. Why would we want to be their test case? That seems like a good way to end up as roadkill.
Yeah, and that's what's
we're going to be the first guy on the beach here. We don't even know where we're charging.
Yeah, it does not. That's not a good place to be.
No. All right. Maybe last word to you, Jen.
I don't have any more words. What else do I have to say? Come on.
Well, it was all very eloquent. Maybe before we wrap up, where can people learn more and support The Line?
theline.substack.com. .com. Yeah, that's right.
There you go.
We'll show up. You'll find us.
Great. Well, I guess that's a wrap for our first attempt at this. We're going to try and find something where maybe Max and I are a little less agreement than this, because I think we will have a shared stake.
And I won't be there. It'll be great. You two have at it. Have fun, boys. And I'll try and avoid having my Jon Stewart moment where I explain how another crossfire is bad for democracy, and you guys are bad for democracy, and you should not do this.
We probably are bad for democracy, but it's just so much fun.
What do you do?
Yeah, we're both going to get yelled at in our respective silos for this. So
we're not allowed. We're not supposed to be talking to one another.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jen, thank you for being our first guest. And Max, it was a slice.
All right. Until next time.
Thank you very much for joining us on our very first episode of Fawcett versus Fildebrandt. Thank you very much, and God bless.